Welcome to lesson 4 of the survival of a nation. This afternoon's class is titled Occupied with Peace on the Viability of Land for Peace. That's an exciting topic if I've ever given one, and it's probably one of the diciest topics I ever have or ever will present. Before we start with the lesson, with the opening lesson video, which we usually do, which presents things as they were during the Six-Day War in 1967, I want to talk for a second about some of the language surrounding this issue. The sensitivity and the controversiality of the topic that we're going to discuss today is such, it's similar to in the US, certain topics like take, for example, abortion, right? So if someone is pro-abortion, then they use the terms either you're pro-life, either you're pro-choice or you're anti-choice, right? And if somebody is anti-abortion, then they will say you're either pro-life or you're anti-life. And that's because words say a lot about where we stand on a topic and how we frame the topic, etc. As a result, when it comes to the land for peace debate, which is the topic of today's class, the two-state solution, so to speak, it's a subject that becomes so difficult to discuss because it's difficult to discuss without expressing an opinion. Because if you're going to even start discussing it, you're either going to use terms like occupied territories or liberated territories, right? Like, is Israel occupying the territories or did Israel liberate the territories? Is it the West Bank or is it Judea and Samaria, right? Are we ceding land if Israel gives land to the Arab nations? Is that ceding land? Or is it returning land, right? And this is kind of like the heated, I think when you have such divisive language, it goes to show how heated the debate has become. Nevertheless, despite the sensitivities, we do our best to explore the issue. Obviously, I cannot honestly claim that this course is going to comprehensively cover the Six-Day War and its impact on the viability for peace throughout the generations, etc. But we'll do our best. Okay, so obviously we have to start off with how and why did these territories come into Israel's possession, and we will do so by watching the lesson video. Please turn your attention to the video screens.
June 1967. Israel was besieged by 3 brutal enemies and had to fight them all at once: Egypt, Jordan, Syria. At stake was the survival of a nation, the life of every Jewish citizen of Israel. The greatest threat came from Egypt, where the match was horribly lopsided. Egypt deployed 100,000 troops in the Sinai Peninsula, while Israel had mobilized 45,000. In machinery and firepower as well, the numbers were heavily unbalanced in Egypt's favor. Israel's Air Force executed a preemptive attack, striking hard in Egypt's own territory. In 2 furious hours, Egypt's Air Force virtually ceased to exist, and its airfields were rendered unusable. But Israel could not rely on an aerial attack alone. Just 15 minutes after her fighter jets roared into action, her ground forces confronted the enormous armored enemy that menaced the Sinai. Israel divided its attack force into 3 divisions. All faced heavy tank battles against exceptional odds. The 1st Division, led by Major General Israel Tau, fought its way to El Arish, the fortified capital of the Sinai Peninsula, along the banks of the Mediterranean. By the next morning, June 6th, El Arish was in Israeli hands. Its last guns fell silent the following night, and neighboring Gaza was conquered that same day. Meanwhile, a 2nd Division, led by Ariel Sharon, headed for the strategic northern junction of Abu Agila. Sharon confused his entrenched enemy by attacking at night from multiple directions. By mid-morning on June 6th, Sharon had secured all strategic areas. A 3rd Reserve Division, led by Brigadier General Avraham Yoff, split in 2. One half silently penetrated Wadi Hiradin, an undefended natural barrier that Egypt considered impassable. This aided Sharon by preventing enemy reinforcements from joining the battles raging in Rafah and Abu Aguila. The other half joined General Tau in a pincer attack against the key high ground of Jebel Litni, where the Egyptians maintained control of their second, deeper defense line. By the evening of June 6, the high grounds had fallen. The afternoon of June 6th found the Egyptian military elite in panic, issuing contradictory orders and abandoning their troops to disorderly retreat. 2 IDF divisions raced to the Suez Canal. Their mission was to block off the Egyptian retreat, allowing the 3rd Division to drive the escaping enemy into a trap and preventing any chance of regrouping. On June 7th, Israel's Navy, joined by a paratrooper unit, arrived in abandoned Sharm el-Sheikh on the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. On June 8, IDF forces reached the Suez Canal. By June 9th, the entirety of Sinai and Gaza was in Israeli hands. Egypt had lost its air force and its army, and had been soundly defeated. It promptly signed a ceasefire. The Sinai, however, was not Israel's only front. On the first morning of war, June 5th, as Egypt's airfield lay smoldering, and with its Sinai forces under heavy attack, Egypt lied to Jordan by claiming false victories over Israel. Egypt ordered its ally to attack Israel. At precisely 9 a.m. on the 5th of June, Jordanian planes and artillery bombarded Israeli positions and airfields, and unleashed an inferno against the unprotected civilians of Jerusalem. Israel appealed for Jordan to stay its hand. General Odd Bull of the UN's peacekeeping force relayed a message from Israeli Prime Minister Eshkol to Jordan's King Hussein. "We are engaged in defensive fighting on the Egyptian sector, and we shall not engage ourselves in any action against Jordan unless Jordan attacks us. Should Jordan attack Israel, we shall go against her with all our might, and the king will have to bear the full responsibility of the consequences." But at 11 a.m., King Hussein formally rejected Israel's overtures. His reply was blunt: "It is too late. The die has been cast." By 12:30, Jordanian shelling shrieked to the tune of a full-blown assault, causing multiple deaths, almost 1,000 wounded, and a trail of destruction. Once again, Israeli jets tore through the skies, rapidly demolishing the entire Jordanian Air Force, allowing Israel's ground forces to capture key border positions, such as the Kalkilia Junction and Latrun stronghold. After this punishment, Israel waited for the heavily bruised Jordan to reconsider, to no avail. Left with no choice, on June 6th, the IDF met the Jordanian army head-on in the West Bank. The struggle to rescue Jerusalem was bitter and costly, but after 2 days of close combat, Israel captured the Old City. Outside of Jerusalem, the bloodiest battle was the Battle of the Dotan Valley. Israel intended a limited struggle to neutralize long-range artillery fire near Jenin, but the war was unintentionally expanded as the battle spread across Judea and Samaria. On the morning of June 7th, Israeli forces arrived at the Samarian city of Shechem, or Nablus. Its residents mistook the IDF for Iraqi troops and welcomed them, but soon realized their error and resisted bitterly until the city fell later that night. East Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank fell with little resistance on June 7th. Israel captured Jericho, the Jordan Valley, the Gush Etzion area, and the Judean cities of Ramallah, Bethlehem, Hebron, Tul-Karim, and Kalkilia. Jordan had suffered a crushing defeat. At 8 p.m. on June 7th, Jordan signed a ceasefire. Israel now controlled the densely populated West Bank, although many locals had fled to Jordan ahead of the Israeli advance. Beside Egypt and Jordan, Israel faced one other major menace: Syria. The Golan mountain range was under Syrian control and heavily fortified, turning Israel's towns into sitting ducks. On the first day of war, Syria's air force had attacked Israel, which responded by eliminating its enemy's air force. The following day, June 6, a Syrian ground invasion of Israel was repelled. Licking its wounds, Syria spent the next 2 days raining destruction on Israeli villages from atop the Golan Heights. Israel bled but could not respond. They were up to their necks in the effective destruction of Egypt and Jordan's armed forces. But when those enemies signed ceasefires, Israel turned a sharp eye to the Syrian bombardment of its northern civilians. Years of sporadic shelling had been a primary instigator of this war, and Israel could not sheathe its sword before pointing its blade at Damascus. On June 9th, Major General David Elazar was ordered to storm the Golan. It was literally an uphill battle, to a plateau some 2,000 feet in the air. The mountain bristled with heavy fortifications, minefields, and trenches. After Israel's Air Force shook the mountainside for 3 hours, its ground forces inched painfully upwards from 5 locations in the northern Hula Valley, exposed to enemy fire all the way. The main attack was towards the town of Kala, where Syrian defenses were weaker due to the impenetrability of the steep cliffs. Sappers cleared mines. Then bulldozers created roads. Then tanks clambered up in single file, accompanied by troops. The invasion took several hours at the tragic cost of heavy casualties. But the strongholds of Kala, Tel Azizat, Tel Fakir, Dardara, and Tel Halel were taken. On the morning of the 10th, Israel captured Banias and Mansara, leaving their path clear to Kenitra, the regional capital and center of Syrian military command, which fell without a fight. In just 1 day of terrible fighting, the strategically crucial Golan Heights was in Israeli hands, removing the nearly 20-year-long threat that towered over northern Israel. With the elimination of the Syrian, Jordanian, and Egyptian threat in just 6 days, Israel not only survived, but tripled in size. The war was won.
Okay. Since that day, well, I should mention that as a follow-up to the Six-Day War, the UN passed Resolution 242, before the year was up, by the way, November of 1967. That resolution, which has become like the internationally accepted basis for future Arab-Israeli negotiations, affirmed that 2 things need to happen before any peace is going to be reached. Number 1, Israel has to return, right? Israel has to go back to the so-called Green Line, right? Which refers to the original border of Israel before the Six-Day War. So in the words of the UN resolution, withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. And number 2 is that there has to be termination of all claims or states involved, that anyone else doesn't exist or doesn't have a right to exist, etc. In other words, that the Arab states need to accept Israel's right to exist and Israel's legitimacy, etc. To which the Israelis responded by saying, that sounds great. We would love to do something like that. We would love to give back whatever, the details of which would have to be discussed, how much land it would give back, but that certain land would be traded in return for peaceful and harmonious living with our neighbors, etc. To which the Arabs famously responded with their 3 no's, famously saying that they want nothing to do with Israel, they won't accept Israel, etc. So ever since that day, and I don't know if the words 2-state solution, were born in November of 1967, but certainly since then it's come to be known as the 2-state solution. And that has come to be the official policy, the official approach of the Israeli government. I think today, till today, it might have changed recently with the recent government, with Bennett now being the prime minister, but I don't think so. That Israel is willing to not only willing, but that Israel believes that the way forward is by having a state of Israel alongside some form of an Arab or Palestinian state, which would live harmoniously side by side, as long as on the flip side the Arabs agree to lay down their weapons, etc. Right, and they actually live peacefully. This has also become the United States's official policy. I mean, we have yet to hear from Biden, I think, about like an official policy about what he feels would be the way forward for peace in the Middle East. But certainly Trump, Obama, Bush for sure, going back for the most part, this has been the US's approach, attempting at all costs to figure out a way that there's some sort of viable two-state solution. If you take a look in your textbook on page, what page is it on? 125, is that it? The figure 4.1 is what I'm talking about. A timeline of the Land for Peace efforts. You can take a look and you can see all the different details and nuances of how this idea has kind of evolved over time. There is international consensus that anything that is perceived as standing in the way of this solution, in other words, anything that would stand in the way of a two-state solution, whether that's expanding Jewish settlements beyond the Green Line or anything else of that nature, has to be condemned, as is evidenced almost on a daily basis in the UN Security Council. But particularly, let's read text 1, which is UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which was adopted in 2016. Heidi, can I ask you to read for us, please? Text 1. There you go.
Okay, sorry. Condemning all measures aimed at altering the demographic composition, character, and status of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem. Reiterating its vision of a region where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. Stressing that the status quo is not sustainable and that significant steps consistent with the transition contemplated by prior agreements are urgently needed in order to, 1, stabilize the situation and to reverse negative trends on the ground, which are steadily eroding the two-state solution and entrenching a one-state reality. And 2, to create the conditions for successful final status negotiations and for advancing the two-state solution through those negotiations and on the ground. 1, reaffirms that the establishment of Israel by settlements in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, has no legal validity and constitutes a flagrant violation under international law and a major obstacle to the achievement of the two-state solution and a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. 3, underlines that it will not recognize any changes to the 4 June 1967 lines, including with regard to Jerusalem, other than those agreed by the parties through negotiations.
So a two-state solution would need to have A, withdrawal from territories by Israel, and number 2, and B, end of the state of war on behalf of all parties. It's well known, however, that there are many who adamantly are against giving away any land, not even 1 inch, et cetera, right? And that's not an unpopular opinion. That's a very, very strong opinion. Before we start today's conversation, I want to stress what the goal is today. On both sides of the discussion, in other words, those that believe that a two-state solution is the only way forward, and that we must give back certain land, or we must give away certain pieces of land in order for there to be peace with our Arab neighbors. And on the flip side, those that say not 1 inch, this is biblical Israel, et cetera, which we're going to examine both sides in depth. It's important to understand that our conversation today is going to be based on a mutual respect to both sides. In other words, these are both people who are intelligent. They love peace. They're not here. Neither of them is here to pursue something the opposite of peace. I'm sure there are some people who choose one of those sides, not for peaceful reasons, but we are going to take the approach that because there are many people on both sides, and probably the leading ones on both sides, that are intelligent, they're peace loving, and number 3, care deeply about Israel. So there will be no attempt today to delegitimize any of those opinions. Now, I am aware that because we're giving a class on Israel to a group of Jews, so probably every single one of you already has a very firm opinion about which side of this coin you stand on, or maybe you stand a little bit on each, but you have already a firm opinion because we've all seen the news, we've all heard about it, we've all thought about it, we've all talked about it with our friends, etc. So what is today's goal? Today's goal is A, to mutually understand with mutual respect both sides of the discussion, and number 2, to try to figure out, based on not some rabbi is going to come today and make up a law, but to understand based on the Torah going back to our Torah, our 613 mitzvahs, what is the Torah's perspective on giving land back for peace? And first of all, I have a feeling that a lot of it might surprise you. Number two, I have a feeling that you're not aware, I'm not judging anybody in particular, but you might not be aware of how much the Torah has to say about this, and very directly. So that's going to be our goal today. Before we do so, let's try exercise number 1. Okay, so on page 128, the question on the table is, and I will stress right now that this is not an optional exercise, this is a mandatory exercise. First of all, because we're going to come back and read this later. And second of all, because whichever side of the aisle you fall on, this will be very, very helpful for you to do the opposite side. Please provide 3 reasons why Israel should allow for the creation of a Palestinian state and 3 reasons why Israel should not. So you don't get to choose to fill out just one side, and you don't get to choose to fill out just one reason. You have to give me 3 reasons why yes, 3 reasons why not. I'll give you a few minutes to do that now. And then if anybody's comfortable sharing, I'd love to hear. If you're not, that's fine. We'll give 1 more minute. Okay. So what do we got? Joanne, give me 1 reason for yes, 1 reason for not. Your best one.
Okay. Without a separate Palestinian state, Israel would not have a majority of Jews.
Okay. This is a very, very popular opinion, which is, and we're going to quote later on in today's class, which is that currently, if you take a look at the trends, the Arab population is growing within Israel. The Arab Israeli population is growing within Israel. So if we want an Israel, which is going to have a majority of Jews, that should be a Jewish state, it's in our best interest to give the Palestinians their own state. Okay. Reason for not?
If there was an independent Palestinian state, it could raise an army to attack Israel.
Right. If history is any proof, then that's probably going to take away from our security. Heidi, you have anything else? Those are probably 2 of the most popular reasons. You want to share a little bit?
No, I don't really have anything else.
Did you come up with those reasons?
No, I didn't.
Okay. I want you to think about this because this is very, very important. Adrian, let's
Well, one reason
Yeah, go ahead.
one reason for creating a Palestinian state is to give the non-Jewish residents of Israel some sense of self-determination.
Right. In other words, the same. So that's another reason, right? Give them the same feeling of self-determination that we have, right? So and that's much more selfless. Joanne's reason.
Okay,
was
but
a Jewish
on the
perspective,
other
selfless.
hand, on the other hand, screw them, make them participate in the army, make them
Be part of Israel. You're saying.
be part of Israel, make them, be involved in supporting the infrastructure.
I just want to point out that can go both ways. That point that
What?
you're mentioning, that I just want to point out that point that you just said, even though you started off with screw them, but that's fine. No, my point is there might be very valid reason to push that the other way. If they're not participating in elections, they're not participating in the army, they're not participating in the economy, then maybe give them their own right to self-determination, let them do their own thing on their own. Because if they're not participating in our country and they don't want to be involved, then why are we forcing them to, right?
Or if they are part of Israel, then
They should be, right.
then they should be doing all of those things.
Okay. Adrian, what do you have to say? You're muted. Adrian? No, that just turned your camera off. We're working on it.
I don't want to stay
There
mute.
you
Am
go.
I better that?
Yeah.
Okay. So I had the first one also that was mentioned, but I thought about something. If the Palestinians are given a state based on, negotiated boundaries, not just whatever they want, then, and if they had an army and they attacked Israel, then, I think that makes it more, quote, legitimate to realize, for Israel to then really respond back in force, because that's a violation of international law if they are a separate state or country.
Right.
Whereas now it's just seen as, not, it is terrorism, but, what I'm saying is if they had legitimacy of a state, wouldn't that then be more of a violation of, people will.
So again, it might be in our best self-interest to have them have their own state, because then, and hopefully that would lead to a little bit more peace. Because if the whole world recognized that this is a country, then all they want to do is attack Israel.
Right.
So just like Egypt in the past 50 years, at least 60 years, right? Egypt hasn't been starting wars with Israel, at least for the most part, and not very blatantly, etc. Thank you, I appreciate that.
That was my point. What you said.
Right. So similarly, then, if there was a Palestinian state, then they wouldn't be able to do that, right? Because at least they'll be held accountable. We would like to hope that they will be held
accountable. Yes.
Okay. Arnold, whatever. Why don't you answer the next question, Arnold? Because I don't want to take up too much time in this conversation. I think it's an important conversation to start off our lesson today. But let me ask you a different question. Arnold, in your opinion, in the course of negotiating peace, should Israel treat Jerusalem, okay, East Jerusalem and or the Old City and the Western Wall, let's go the Western Wall, the Western Wall and the Old City of Jerusalem, should that be treated any differently than, let's say, the Golan Heights? Should that be as much on the table as the Golan Heights, or should there be a difference between the two? What do you think?
Frankly, I think it should be the same as with the Golan Heights.
Not to the same thing, even though it's the holiest place in Judaism, the same thing. Joanne, what do you think?
I'm not sure. Are the Golan Heights on the table? Is that it?
Let's assume the Golan Heights is definitely part of the occupied territory, so to speak, right? So let's assume they are. Should Jerusalem be just as much as the West Bank, or just as much as Gaza?
Oh, I see.
Or should that be off the table? Should Jerusalem be off the table?
Off the table.
I'm as liberal as I am. I'm going to have to say Jerusalem has to be off the table.
Has to be off the table. Why? And I assume everybody is saying that because it's so important to us, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Heidi, your thoughts?
Jerusalem?
Yeah. On the table or off the table?
It should be off the table. I mean, it's not,
We're in agreement.
Okay.
I
So
mean,
we have a unanimous agreement.
But let me ask you a question. What makes Jerusalem so important to the Muslims? Because
No, I understand. There's lots of reasons
the
why.
recollection is,
I'm gonna
Mecca
stop
is their,
100%. 100%.
Mecca
Hold
is
on.
their spot.
Hold on. I'm going to stop you there because there's a lot of reasons why. I just wanted to get everybody's opinion here. It seems that there's pretty unanimous agreement that Jerusalem should be off the table. It's too important to us, and other things maybe yes, but Jerusalem was ours to begin with, and there's lots of other reasons that we can give, etc. Okay. What we're going to do for the rest of today's class, which means in the hour that we have remaining, is we are going to try to imagine, okay, this is a very good thought experiment, okay, that instead of this discussion being in the Knesset, imagine it's in a tent, and the one presiding over it is Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, Moses is the one who has to make a decision about this. This is the situation. This is what's going on with Israel. And Moses, what do you think? Right? And Moses is going to make a decision strictly based on the Torah and strictly based on halacha. And that's where our conversation is going to go from now on. Okay, and you're going to see that halacha takes some very, very interesting things into account, and I think you might be very surprised. I'm not suggesting that maybe by the end of today's class, each of you will fully adopt, although I would love that, that each of you will fully adopt the Torah perspective, but you might be very surprised as to what the Torah has to say about this. Okay, so let's dive into it. Let's start with settling the land. Okay, so there is a mitzvah. Well, let's back up a second. How do we decide mitzvahs? Okay, so as it turns out, we have a Torah, 5 books of Moses, etc. And in that Torah, we are told, the Talmud tells us in Tractate Makot, that there are 613 mitzvot, 248 positive, 365 negative. However, in the Torah, there isn't that much. If you ever looked inside a Torah scroll, you may have noticed that there isn't that much in terms of formatting. there certainly isn't a bullet point list, right? It doesn't say, here comes mitzvah number 1, mitzvah number 2, there aren't even footnotes on the bottom that say, well, that verse, that was mitzvah number 1. So there is slight disagreement. I say slight because maybe it's 50, 60 mitzvahs that out of the 613 that there's kind of like discussion. Oh, is this one a mitzvah or is it just a detail in another mitzvah? Especially sometimes because you have a positive commandment and a negative commandment, which are essentially the same thing. Shabbat comes to mind. There's a positive commandment to keep Shabbat and rest on Shabbat, and there's a negative commandment not to work on Shabbat. So there's slight disagreement about the mitzvahs in the Torah. As it turns out, that there's a verse. And Arnold, if you can read it for us, please. It's on page 129, text 2a. Go ahead.
Okay, 129. You shall vacate the land of its inhabitants and settle in it, for I have given the land to you to inherit.
So this is a verse from Bamidbar, and the Rambam, Maimonides, looks at this verse and says, "Look, I could sit and explain my reasons why, but if you take a look at the list of mitzvot from the Rambam, settling or conquering the land of Israel is not one of them. According to Maimonides, it's not there. Now, about 100 years later, lives a man named Nachmanides, the Ramban. Okay, this is for those who are not familiar. This is in either the 10th, the 11th century or the 12th century. Okay, and Nachmanides says, I take big objection to the fact that the Rambam or Maimonides would not have included this in his count. Arnold, can you continue, please? Text 2b.
We have been commanded to take the possession of the land that God gave to our forefathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and not to leave the land in the hands of any other nation or allow it to remain unpopulated. Thus, God instructed the children of Israel, "Ye shall vacate the land of inhabitants and settle in it, for I have given the land to you to inherit." The sages greatly extolled the importance of the mitzvah of dwelling in the land. On top of their many lavish praises, they went so far as to say, whoever leaves the land and dwells in the diaspora is analogous to an idol worship. And this was Talmud. It is my contention that all of this praise is due to the biblical commandment to take possession of the land and dwell in it. This commandment applied to all generations, and every one of us is obligated to fulfill it, even in times of exile.
I should note, thank you, Arnold. I should note that Nachmanides himself made good on what he wrote, and in the last 3 years of his life, he traveled to Israel and spent the last 3 years of his life in Israel. Okay, so Nachmanides splits this mitzvah into two, and he says, number one, so he takes issue with the Rambam, right, with Maimonides. There we go. So is settling the land a biblical command? Maimonides says no. Nachmanides says yes. But when Nachmanides says yes, he divides it into two. He says, number one, we have to take possession of the land. And number two, we then need to live in the land. And he adds to that this mitzvah is applicable at all times. In other words, this has nothing to do with the Holy Temple and the fact that we might be in Jerusalem, etc. So the argument now, hold on a second. It's important to understand there is another mitzvah, which is called Shelo Yalu B'choma, which means there's a prohibition against taking land by force, taking the land of Israel by force, so long as Mashiach had not come, which we will not talk that much about today, but is a huge part of the topic of next week's class. So that's kind of the argument against why not. But according to Nachmanides, if we have to some extent, if it's possible, we should be doing it. In fact, Nachmanides' grandson kind of tries to, who is the Rashbash, just text 3, and Joanne, if I can ask you to read it for us, please. He points out what might be a practical way to go about this. Go ahead.
Undoubtedly, to dwell in the land of Israel is a great mitzvah. This is true in all generations, whether or not the Holy Temple is standing in Jerusalem. My grandfather, Nachmanides, lists this mitzvah among the 613 biblical commandments, citing the verse, "You shall vacate the land of its inhabitants and settle in it." However, This obligation does not lie collectively upon the exiled nation of Israel. In fact, while in exile, the collective is enjoined from fulfilling this mitzvah. Currently, the mitzvah is incumbent upon the individual. Every individual is urged to go and dwell in the land.
So he qualifies, thank you, Joanne. He qualifies his grandfather's words and he says, listen, sure, the pasuk says, the verse says, you shall vacate the land and settle in it, which leads us to say conquer and live. We should conquer and live in it. He says, but today, because we're in exile, we should just be doing it to the extent possible, which means take away the conquering. There's no such obligation for multiple reasons. And instead, our obligation just becomes to live in the land of Israel as much as we can. So if anybody can afford to live in the land of Israel and has the ability to move there and nothing else is going to get ruined, which we can talk about in a moment, then they should go and live in the land of Israel, right? If the opportunity presents itself to go and purchase a plot, which might be why a lot of people make aliyah in today's day and age. Now, putting this aside, before we continue our conversation in that regard about why Jews live in the diaspora and why everybody doesn't just move to Israel, certainly according to Nachmanides, etc., why doesn't Maimonides agree? Why doesn't Maimonides count this as a mitzvah? So there are many different conversations that people have. Many of the commentary give different reasons, some of them almost like opposing to each other. But let's talk about something. Number one is some scholars say that Maimonides agrees that there's an obligation to conquer all the land. He just says that that's only applicable in the times when the Holy Temple was standing. So Nachmanides clearly diverts from that, right? He says, no. Even when there's no Holy Temple, Israel is Israel. But Maimonides connects it with the Holy Temple. So he says, until we rebuild the Holy Temple, which at this point we're waiting for Mashiach, that whole obligation kind of falls off. Number two, another reason that people give is they say, look, you're taking the verse out of context. That verse is telling the Jewish people, it's before the Jewish people even went into the land of Israel. That mitzvah was not one of the 613 which apply for all time. Rather, it was a horat shah, which means it's like a temporary injunction telling the people of Israel how they should enter the land of Israel. And they actually did that mitzvah already. They conquered it, led by Joshua, 7 years of conquering, and 7 years of settling, and that's it. That verse no longer, I mean, of course it applies and it has relevance to us, etc., but it's not a mitzvah for us. It's not one of the 613 obligations that we have. And number three, some of them say, Maimonides is really this is not a novelty what he says here. He's actually just following Rashi's perspective. Rashi on that verse says that this is not the Torah telling us a mitzvah. This is just Moses. Remember, this is in Deuteronomy. He says Moses is telling us counsel, wise counsel, right? That when we come to Israel, we should conquer it and settle it, etc. And it's kind of like it's not to be understood that it's just advice how you should live in Israel peacefully, but it's not necessarily a mitzvah that obligates us to have done that. Before we keep going, okay, so that kind of summarizes the argument between Nachmanides and Maimonides about whether or not today does Joanne and Adrian and Yosef Ilan and Heidi and myself, do we have an obligation today to go and conquer the land of Israel from the biblical land of Israel from its enemies and settle it? And it seems to me that there's two different opinions. For the most part, they agree conquering is not the right perspective, but with regards to living there and by extension certainly giving away land to others, right? It would seem that Nachmanides would be strongly in favor of every Jew owning as much land of Israel as possible, and certainly not giving it away. And Maimonides would not necessarily. Before we keep going, I have an optional 5 minutes that I can stick in here, and I'd love to know if you guys are interested in this, which is as follows. This undoubtedly brings up the question as to why are the five of us not living in the land of Israel, at least according to Nachmanides. Is anybody interested in pursuing that, or should we keep moving? Keep moving. Okay. Heidi says, yeah, we should do it. Okay, so I'll do it very briefly. I'll give it a little bit of justice and we'll keep moving. There are three reasons given for why, by classic Jewish commentators, for why Jews might still live in the diaspora. One of them is that it might be more complex to live in the land of Israel and we don't know enough about the laws. So think teruma and meiser, tithing, etc. These sorts of things. Shemitah, right? The seventh Jubilee, the seventh year of the agricultural cycle, etc. Another reason given is that we only have an obligation to live in the land of Israel if it's just as viable as living in the diaspora. So let's say if you have a job, or right, many people find they make aliyah and they don't have a viable income in the land of Israel, so that would be another valid reason. And number three, which I personally count as my own reason, is that if you're in any sort of position of influence outside the land of Israel, and there's a doubt that your work might not be done through someone else, and if you move to the land of Israel, that work wouldn't happen, whether it's physical or spiritual. In other words, whether it's like you run some sort of charity to help people, etc., or you happen to know people and you're helping people, etc., or if you're in a spiritual position of leadership, so then that takes precedence over living in the land of Israel. Okay, so that's just a little bit of justice to that topic. There's more to say, but I'll keep it brief. Okay. So far from the Torah, we have one perspective on whether we should or should not be giving back land, and or giving away land, and that is the mitzvah of settling the land of Israel. According to Maimonides, it's actually not a mitzvah. According to Nachmanides, it is, and we have an obligation to do so today, and therefore we should not be giving away land. Number two, let's turn to another verse in the Torah. Where are we here? Adrian, can you read for us? Oh, you don't have a text. I'm sorry. So I guess Heidi, can you please read for us text 4a?
When your God brings you into the land you are when your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, he will cast away from before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations that are more numerous and powerful than you. Do not make a covenant with them, nor be gracious to them.
Okay, those last 3 words, do not be gracious to them, in Hebrew are known as lo techanim. Okay, lo techanim, which technically means do not be gracious to them. Many commentaries point out that the same word techanim also shares the same root as chanaya, which means to kind of settle, which means that this is a prohibition against letting other nations settle in the land of Israel. Ooh, so there actually might be a prohibition against allowing non-Jews to settle in the land of Israel. Now, it might not always be in our power, but if it is in our power, it's possible that there's a mitzvah for us to even sell and make a profit off of one house in Israel. If you own property in Israel, you might not be allowed to sell it to a non-Jew. This prohibition is brought into Jewish law, obviously, by the codifiers, right? So Shulchan Aruch. Where are we here? Arnold, can you read for us, please? Text 4. Sorry, Heidi, just keep going. Text 4b. Don't forget to unmute. Sorry.
Sorry, I thought I did. Okay.
Text 4b.
Yes, it is forbidden to sell to idolaters houses and fields in the land of Israel. However, it is permitted to rent out to them houses, but not fields.
Okay. So without getting into the details of why, this ties into the agricultural laws of Truma and Meiser, why you're not allowed to rent fields. But without getting to that nuance, the general idea, says Shulchan Aruch, is that there's actually a prohibition that exists today against giving away a piece of land to someone else, right? Now, obviously, we haven't yet discussed whether for peace, right? But meaning if it adds to our safety and security. But for now, it's just giving away a piece of land would be prohibited. Now, there is a very big counter argument to this, because you have to take this in context. The verse that we have up on the screen now, that when your God brings you to the land, do not make a covenant with them, nor let them settle. These words are immediately succeeded by, and then go and destroy any idols that there are, etc. So most commentary agree that the reason why you're not allowed to sell land to an idolater, right? Which if you take a look at text 4b, he says you're not allowed to give to idolaters, right? You're not allowed to sell to idolaters. Why is that? It's because we're worried that if you sell a piece of the land to Israel to someone who serves idols, then the Jews will learn from them. By the way, this is not describing theory, this is describing fact, right? Historically, there were non-Jews who lived in Israel. They did serve idols. The Jews did learn from them. And there were even times when the entire Judaism was kind of, very, very much under threat by idolatry. The question is, though, so then how do we apply that to today? If the prohibition is not to sell land to idolaters, I mean, I don't want to get into the exact nuanced details about whether Islam and Christianity are considered idolatry, but I think everybody agrees Islam is not. And Christianity depends on whether you're looking at it for a Jew to do something Christian or for a non-Jew to do something Christian. And my understanding is that for a non-Jew to do something Christian would still be him abiding by the 7 Noahide laws, and he wouldn't be considered an idol worshiper. But for a Jew to do something because we're held to a higher standard and we have other prohibitions, with regards to us, different would be. But hold on a second. For the most part, those are both monotheistic religions, believe in one God, which means they're not idolaters. There's nobody in the land of Israel that serves idols. Maybe in India there still are some, right? But in Israel, for the most part, there isn't anyone like that. So perhaps we would be allowed to give back land based on this prohibition. Okay, so we have two things so far, and both of them have opinions here on both sides. We have one prohibition against one mitzvah, not a prohibition, a mitzvah, in other words, a commandment to conquer and settle the land of Israel. But as we saw, that's up for debate. Nachmanides and Maimonides. We have another mitzvah, which is not to allow non-Jews to settle the land of Israel, but it turns out that would probably only apply to idolaters. But let's do one third and final thing, which is not really going to tie into a mitzvah. It's going to tie much more to a Jewish attitude. Raise your hand. Anybody familiar with the Hebrew word for Jew, which is Yehudi? Anybody know the origin of that word? Anybody? Okay, let's do text 5. It comes from Yehuda, okay? And Joanne, I'll ask you to read this for us, please. It comes from Yehuda, who was the fourth, of course, of the tribes. You're good, yeah, Joanne. You're unmuted already. It comes from Yehuda, which is the fourth of the 12 tribes, and Yehuda means to give gratitude. And there's a reason why this ended up being a name of the Jews throughout. Go ahead, text 5.
Upon giving birth to her fourth son, Leah became the first to express God for his deliverance, to express gratitude to God for his deliverance, and she therefore named her son Judah. All of Israel is called by his name because the uniqueness of the Jewish people is that they recognize that everything comes from God, their deliverer, and they express their gratitude to him for this.
Gratitude, thank you, Joanne. Gratitude is a major tenet of Judaism. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I always like to point out in order to show the emphasis of gratitude that there is, even though there's many places, think Kibbutz Avayim, honoring your parents, but one of the things that I like to point out is that when it comes to davening, right, to the prayers, so we always do the Amidah, right, the silent prayer, and then the Chazan, or the cantor, repeats the repetition of the Amidah, right? We're all familiar with this process from being in synagogue. Now, when the Chazan, the cantor, repeats the repetition of the Amidah, every single blessing that he says it, and he does it on our behalf, and he's kind of leading the prayers on our behalf. There's only one prayer that when he says it, we are enjoined to join him and say it together with him. And that is the prayer of Modi Manachnu Lach, which means we show gratitude to God. Because there cannot be someone who shows gratitude to God and we all stand there and say, we're not in the mood of it right now. We are required to stand up and say, oh, he's showing gratitude to God. We also want to show gratitude to God. And that's because gratitude is a huge, huge fundamental in Jewish life. Text 6 points out some of the details behind this, or some of the mitzvahs that come from this. We're on page 134. Arnold, can you read for us, please?
In the interest of maintaining peaceful relations.
Oh, hold on. I mixed up. Hold on a second. So perhaps one of the ways of looking at this whole debate is gratitude. In general, if God gives us something, we shouldn't throw it back in his face. And certainly, we'll talk next week about the miracles that there were during the 6-day war and how everyone agrees that it was a fairly miraculous victory. And the Jews didn't even enter the war. They weren't even looking for war. They were happy. They had a land of Israel. It was tiny. It was a little thing, whatever. They weren't looking for more. And then God gave us this tremendous gift. Didn't look like it at the time, but looking back, right? We now have all of our holy sites back. Israel expanded tremendously. And we turn to God and we say, no thanks. Here, throw it back in his face. What kind of gratitude is that to show to God? Right? Mm-hmm. The problem with this argument is that on the flip side of gratitude, there is an equally large Jewish tenet, and that is the fundamental of peace. Arnold, text 6.
In the interest of maintaining peaceful relations, our sages instructed us to visit the non-Jewish sick, bury their dead, and give charity to their poor, just as we do to our fellow Jews. The imperative to be kind to non-Jews is based on the scriptures, for it is written, God is good to all, and his compassion extends to all his creation, which is from Psalms. And it is written, the ways of the Torah are sweet, and all her paths are peaceful.
So on the one side of this coin, we have Yehudi, Jew. It's all about hoda'ah. It's all about gratitude. And on the other side of the coin, we have that the ways of the Torah and all our paths are peace. So we have these two. We are a grateful nation, but we're also a peaceful nation. We have these two strong fundamentals that there are in Judaism. Which is more important? So again, there are three reasons why we might say that it makes sense to be giving land away, but each of them has a strong counter argument. If you look at the mitzvah for settling the land of Israel, there's one opinion that's all for it. There's another opinion that says that's not an obligation we have in today's day and age because we live in exile. If you look at this from a perspective of not allowing non-Jews to settle in the land of Israel, that's all nice, fine, and dandy, but that might only apply to idolaters. And if we base our attitude of not giving back land on being a grateful nation, we should be grateful to God, we're also a peaceful nation. So there's a flip side to every single argument, and not just a flip side, but a valid flip side, like a very strong and valid flip side. Which brings us to the Torah's perspective. And that is going to be, well, we've been discussing the Torah's perspective till now, but it brings us to one more strong and overarching thing or rationale, which we're going to think about at length, and which is really going to be the basis for whether we decide to give back or not give back land. And that is pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh means the sanctity of human life. It is well known that the Jewish perspective on human life is very, very strong. Judaism believes that human life is important above all else. Shabbat, for instance, which is punishable by death, desecrating Shabbat. We desecrate Shabbat in order to save a human life. Not only that, every single mitzvah in the Torah gets pushed aside, besides for three, in order to save a life. Because as the Talmud tells us, saving a life is like saving a world, even one human life. And there have been times in history when the rest of the world agreed with that. And there have been times in history when, like today, for instance, when human life is regarded as sacred. And there have been times in history when it wasn't. But Judaism has always taken that as a strong fundamental to our religion, and it supersedes everything else. Life is more precious than any of the commandments. And Maimonides has some very harsh words for someone who says otherwise. Heidi, can you read for us again, please? Don't forget to unmute. Text 7.
7, yes, got it. This teaches that the laws of the Torah are not vengeful. Rather, they bring compassion, kindness, and peace to the world. As for those heretics who say that administering life-saving treatment constitutes a forbidden violation of the Shabbat, one may apply to them the verse, I gave them harmful statutes and laws by which they cannot live.
So it turns out that we are, and the Rambam is saying this in no uncertain terms, that you should not ever pretend to be holier than thou and say, oh, I know I'm allowed to desecrate Shabbat in order to take my wife to the hospital because she's about to give birth, but I don't know, I can't bring myself to desecrate Shabbat. I'm just too holy for that. Rambam says, you're fooling yourself, and this has nothing to do with God. This is your own selfish whatever, That's not what it is. So it turns out that even though the 3 or 4 points we've been considering till now, which is our obligation to settle the land of Israel, our obligation to make sure that others are not settling the land of Israel, gratitude, having gratitude towards God, or trying to be as peaceful as possible, all 4 of those things would be totally pushed aside if there were human lives at stake. Which leads Rabbi Ovadia Yosef in text, right? So that's where we are now. So cede or retain land, we now have a new barometer. Will it put lives at risk? Because every single human being was created in the image of God, human life is trumps all, and that's the first thing that we have to be wary of when it comes to, if we give back a piece of land, is that going to bring peace, or it's not going to bring peace? Is not enough. Is that going to save more human lives, or is that going to put more human lives at risk? Okay, which leads in text 8, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, where were we here? I think Heidi, you just read, right? So Arnold, if you can read for us text 8, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who just lived recently, and he was the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel, gives his verdict on this matter. Go ahead.
If it were determined beyond any doubt that returning the territories to our Arab neighbors would result in true peace, and that the immediate threat of war looms if the territories are not returned, we must then return the territories, for nothing is of greater importance than saving lives.
So it turns out, I just want to point out where we are now, that we've now arrived at the trump card for everything. It doesn't make a difference what you're talking about. I don't care if you're giving back a doghouse or if you're giving away the entire land of Israel. The one thing on the table has to be, is this going to endanger or save lives? So it doesn't make a difference if we call them occupied territories or if we call them liberated ancestral lands. It doesn't make a difference if you're talking about the Sinai Peninsula, right, which is mostly outside the borders of biblical Israel, or if you're talking about a densely populated Arab area like the Gaza Strip, or if you're talking about the eternal Jewish capital of Jerusalem, right, or even the Western Wall itself. It doesn't make a difference. The Torah's perspective would be, is this endangering lives or is this saving lives? What is this going to bring to? Now, I'm not saying that's a simple issue, right? But the green line and any sort of political perspective we have on these has zero relevance. So far as the Torah is concerned, is this going to preserve human life or is this going to endanger human life? I'll point out another very strong point, okay, which you may have noticed that I've been being very careful not to say Jewish lives. The fact that a human being is created b'tselem Elokim in the image of God, and therefore human life is important, is not only a Jewish life. We don't just desecrate a mitzvah in order to save a Jewish life, it's to save any life.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to these conversations, equally as important as Jewish lives will be Arab lives. Is giving back this particular piece of land going to be possibly not just dangerous for Jews? Maybe somehow the Jews will be safe. You know, they have an Iron Dome, so they can give back everything and the Jews won't. But will it endanger Arab lives? I bet you that's not something you were thinking about when I said we're going to introduce the Torah's perspective on the viability of land for peace. So now we're left with the question of, will it endanger or will it preserve human life? Mm-hmm. So let me start by asking you a question, which is on page 136. In your estimation, does exchanging land for peace, now we have our prism through which we should be looking at it, mm-hmm. Do you think that exchanging land for peace and or allowing for the creation of a Palestinian state, right, the two-state solution we mentioned at the beginning, do you feel it endangers lives overall or saves lives? Adrian, what do you think? You're muted. Hold on. Unmute.
Okay.
There you go.
Got it. Okay.
What do you think?
Well, you know, I certainly to this point, I have thought that giving them land or giving it back or returning it or away, ceding it would be dangerous to us, that it would threaten our lives. So that's the belief that I've held. Okay.
And what do you think now?
Well, I mean, you just raised an interesting thing. I mean, I just think, you know, I guess logically you could say, well, if they get, we know that they want all of Israel. They don't just want, you know, Jerusalem or a little bit of there.
Second, you're bringing up some very valid points. That could
right. Can we trust them?
It's going to endanger Jewish lives or not?
Yes, I think that they have proven themselves over centuries to be untrustworthy.
So you feel that exchanging land for peace would not save lives; it would only endanger lives. Joanne, what do you think?
Yes.
I don't know what to think.
Okay.
I really don't. I mean, I understand, you know, what Adrian is saying, and you know, I just don't know. I look at history of other places. I mean, when the Native Americans ended up giving up a lot of land, was it for peace or were they forced to? We don't seem to have Indian wars anymore, but I think that's a power issue, and I don't think they're going to rise up. And anyway,
well, but, Joanne,
you know, I don't have an answer.
Okay, well, I have very liberating news for you. Okay, I was going to go around and get everybody's opinion first before I slap you guys all in the face, but it turns out it actually makes zero difference what you guys think. It turns out it makes zero difference what I think. You know
It's
why?
true.
Because I'll tell you why. No, I'm not just because we're sitting in Pasadena and let's say we were in position. It turns out that there's only one opinion that the Torah takes into account when it comes to such a question. And that is who? That is military commanders. Now, I'm not saying that's simple, okay?
Mhm.
We're going to take some time now to see two conflicting opinions. And Joanne, since you're unmuted, why don't you read them for us? Text 9a and text 9b, both military commanders, and we'll see that there's two sides to the coin. Go ahead.
Okay, the first one is Amnon Resha. Israel's security and her Jewish democratic nature can only be secured through parting ways with the Palestinians. This is a national security interest of the highest order. The agreement with the Palestinians will be based on the two states for two nations principle and founded on the 1967 borders.
Okay, so Amnon Resha.
1967.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
after the 6-Day War.
No, that was the
No,
Six-Day
no,
War.
no, no. 1967 was the 6th War. He's saying that there should be some sort of two-state solution, and it should be founded on 1967 borders, however that ends up happening. But leaving that aside for a second, okay, leaving that where they would be for the purpose of our conversation is irrelevant. The point that he's making here is that we should give back land, okay. But I want you to take a look to what he says. What is the reason he feels right? So he's by the way, both of these people are alive, okay. Amnon Reshef was the Israeli army general and peace advocate. Right, so he was an army general at one point. He's a military commander. But look at his perspective. Give back land. Why? Because Israel's security can only be secured through this. Now let's look at the flip side. Yaakov Amidrar, who also was an Israeli general and security expert. Go ahead, Joanne.
Regarding the question of Israel's borders from a professional military viewpoint, an Israeli withdrawal to the pre-1967 lines will endanger Israel for the following reasons. Israel will not be able to defend itself against a future conventional military threat. Considering the current situation in the Middle East, no one can guarantee that such a threat will not materialize.
Exactly.
Israel's ability to prevent the destruction of its national infrastructure in the event of missile attacks will be greatly reduced, and its retaliatory capacity will also be significantly restricted. As a result of these two weaknesses, the likelihood will increase that Israel's enemies will utilize their newfound advantage to attack Israel in one or both of these ways. A security buffer zone beyond the border barrier is a vital component to border security, increasing the barrier's effectiveness in preventing terrorist infiltration.
Thank you, Joanne. So the question on the table is, does land for peace endanger or save human life? Okay. On one side, on the save side, in other words, giving back land, right? Land for peace will save human life. We have Amnon Reshef, who says Israel's security can only be secured through parting ways with the Palestinians, and he explains his reasoning. On the flip side, we have Yaakov Amidrar, who says that land for peace would only endanger the Jewish people, and he gives 4 reasons for why. Right? But I want to point out that regardless of who these people are and what their opinion is, they're both choosing to base their opinion on whether Israel will be more secure or not, whether it will endanger or save human life, which brings us to the question of who should be the one to decide such a question, right? Giving back land can obviously be spun both ways, and who should be the one to decide it? Hold on a second. So we're going to answer that question shortly, okay? Who should be the one to decide it? I've already said that it shouldn't be you guys, and I'm going to agree that it shouldn't be me. It shouldn't be a rabbi either, and it should be some form of a military commander. And before we do that, I think we need to fine-tune the question a little bit, which means as follows. Okay, let's just understand that when we talk about this, we have to make sure that the only thing on the table is pikuach nefesh. The only deciding factor is, will this save or endanger lives? Okay. Now, this is very important to bear in mind because number one, it means we immediately need to remove from the factor all of the non-pikuach nefesh arguments, all of the non-preserving human life factors from the conversation. Okay. Unless you say right now, because I've been harping on this point for a while, unless you say, of course, who's going to bring up anything else besides for saving human life? Now is a great time to go back to your to your arguments from the beginning of the class, okay? And I think you will find that a lot of you were actually saying exactly what on page 138, Shaul Arieli is about to say, that there's other reasons why you feel we should or shouldn't be giving back land. And that had nothing to do with endangering human life, but actually have more to do with Zionistic or political motivations. Arnold, can you read for us, please, text 10? Shaul Arieli. This is an example of someone who's approaching the question completely, human life doesn't seem to be part of the equation. Go ahead.
The commanders, I among them, can see the reality taking form right in front of us. We seek only to warn the Zionist public against the unilateral annexation that the government is initiating. In the name of messianic nationalism, these steps threaten the Zionist vision of a democratic state for the Jewish people with equal rights for all. In 1967, the government annexed 70 square kilometers of East Jerusalem, on which 69,000 Palestinians lived at that time, constituting just 26% of the combined city's population. By 2015, these numbers had reached 320,000 and almost 40%. Because of Jewish migration from the city, because of its many tensions within 2 decades of Israel's capital, will clearly become a city with a Jewish minority. If the Palestinians change their policy and decide to take part in local elections, the mayor and most of the city council will be Palestinians. Much of the same would happen with unilateral united Israel. If we succumb to the annexation language of Habayit,
Abayit HaYehudi, that's an Israeli party. That's actually the one, or at least part of the one, that actually just recently rose to power in Israel. Go ahead. He mentions the names.
Okay. At time of annexation, the proper proportion of Jews would be about 60%, but within 15 years, the country would have an Arab majority. We would wake up into the reality that David Ben-Gurion warned about in 1947, even before Israel existed. There can be no stable and strong Jewish state so long as it has a Jewish majority of only 60%.
This is very interesting. Take a look at what Arieli is suggesting.
Yeah.
He has a whole conversation about why we shouldn't be pursuing a two-state solution, or why we should be pursuing a two-state solution, right? So he's presenting an opinion as to why we should or shouldn't be giving away land, right? But there's not a single mention of human life here. Now, I promise you, don't get me wrong. I look at this and I'm freaked out. I'm thinking, oh my God. Before you know it, the Arabs will be the majority in Jerusalem. There'll be a Palestinian mayor, and everything will be gone. It freaks me out. I promise you, it freaks me out. But look how he doesn't even talk about human life. He talked about it contravenes the Zionist vision of a democratic state for the Jewish people with equal rights for all. And number two, the two demographic considerations, soon the status of Israel as a Jewish majority state might not be a reality. He doesn't mention once that may or may not lead to Jewish security issues, which these points obviously cannot be separated from Jewish security issues, but that's not his concern. He wants Zionism to continue, and he wants it to be a Jewish majority, and these are his concerns here. And many people, that's what they bring up. They don't bring up the danger to human life that there might be. There's many different arguments that are brought up. Politicians will bring things up like political perspectives or what freedoms that there will or won't be, etc. And human life is completely not on the table. Okay, so number one, back to our slide here. So to fine tune our question, number one, we have to zone in on what the issue is here on the table, at least according to the Torah, and that is preservation of human life. Is this going to lead to human lives being saved or endangered? Every single time we have to ask that question, and everything else has to be removed from the equation. Political incentives for sure, Zionist aspirations also. Everything has to be removed because the one thing on the table here, according to the Torah, is are human lives being preserved or endangered? And number two is we have to stay in the present, okay? Which means, according to the Torah, Immediate danger always overrides potential danger. So you have a lot of people who bring up that, yeah, a two-state solution might possibly bring a little bit of immediate danger, and we might have to work with that, etc. But overall, over the long term, eventually they'll establish their own state, and then we'll be able to live side by side harmoniously, and it'll take away a lot of much larger looming potential danger that we may be in. According to the Torah, we always look at immediate consequences, and that's the only thing on the table. The long term is not what makes our decision here and now. In order to illustrate the point, I don't want to get into this at length, and obviously this has relevance in all sorts of fields. But imagine if you were the director of a hospital, and you're fighting COVID, and for some reason, I don't know, the politicians, or maybe you don't have enough money, you're not getting enough ventilators, right? And you make a decision that if 2 or 3 people are not put on a ventilator or are not given the best care and they die, then that will actually bring a lot more attention to your hospital, and maybe will arouse the sympathy of certain philanthropists that you've been working with, and they'll give you a couple million more dollars, and then you'll be able to buy 50 more ventilators and be able to save so many more lives. The Torah doesn't allow such a calculation to even come to the table. The question on the table is, right now, how many lives can I save? Future lives don't present. This is discussed at length in medical morality conversations that are based on the Torah. It's discussed at length that this is, whenever the Torah is presented with 2 options, one of them is potential danger now, actual danger now versus potential danger in the future. Always the actual danger on the table right now is what overrides any potential danger in the future. So that's a second factor to take into account. And one more factor, which I mentioned before, is that the opinions of everybody on this Zoom have 0 relevance. Okay, now let's expand that. The opinions of rabbis have 0 relevance. A rabbi is consulted when it comes to what does the Torah have to say. But when it comes to the facts on the ground, a rabbi cannot know. Even if he thinks, even if that rabbi happens to be a military professional also, it's not enough. You need to consult the military and security experts right now. Now, let me also rule out another huge part of the population, which is the politicians. And here's where it gets very, very iffy and very tricky, because whereas in the United States, most politicians have a background and a previous career path of having been lawyers, in Israel, most current politicians are former IDF strategists and chiefs of staff and generals, etc. So take a look at the history, everybody. From Bibi Netanyahu to Naftali Bennett to Ariel Sharon to anybody, right? Now, here's the problem though. The moment that somebody goes from being a military expert, and that's his only job, right, to provide for the safety and security of Israel, to being a politician, as we all know, politics has this very, very strange way of tainting everything from your medical opinion to your military opinion to your everything. It all of a sudden becomes judged becomes judged through a new lens with it, which is what makes me more popular or less popular, what will get me reelected or not reelected, etc., and all sorts of other factors as such. And as a result, the Torah's perspective, which, as we said, is all going to be about whether it's going to save or endanger lives, has to be only based on opinions of those who actually have that paradigm. In other words, yeah, that expertise, Joanne, but also that paradigm. That's the way they think. They think through that lens and not through anything else. Okay? By way of example, let's take a look at text 11. Text 11 is basically like this. You're presented with a situation where it's Yom Kippur, right? For instance, we were presented with a situation a year ago, right? Kitty had a baby on Rosh Hashanah or the day after Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur comes 9 days later. Biblically, she's supposed to fast, right? So the rabbis tell us that if it's going to present a danger, right? Human life is above all else, right? If it's going to present a danger to either Kitty or the baby, right? Let's remove it from the personal, to a mother or the baby, or let's say it's a sick person. This sick person is going to present a danger to them. So then, of course, they shouldn't be fasting, right? Now, every rabbi will tell that to you in a heartbeat, because that's clear Jewish law. The question is this a danger or not, right? Somebody comes into shul and says, I have a splitting headache. I feel like I'm going to die, Rabbi. So do we tell him, all right, no problem. You don't need a fast on Yom Kippur? Obviously not, right? Whose decision is that based on? So it turns out that it's very, very simple how we go about it. I can't remember where we were holding here. So Arnold, Text 11, Shulchan Aruch. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
If a patient maintains that he or she does not need to eat, but a doctor, even a non-Jewish doctor, insists that the patient must eat, we feed the patient as per the doctor's instructions. This is provided that the doctor is an expert medical practitioner.
So now let me just take this a step further. Okay, so it turns out, how do we make such a decision? You bring the rabbi into the room. The rabbi says, well, if it's a danger to her life or his life, sure, you can go ahead and eat on Yom Kippur, right? So we bring in a medical professional, bring in a medical expert. And if there's two people and one of them is more expert than the other, maybe particularly in this thing, one of them is an OB or one of them is a podiatrist or one of them, whatever it is, right? You know, you got to choose the one that's relevant in this situation. And that expert, if he or she says that it may possibly be a danger to this person's life, boom, they eat on Yom Kippur. Now, I will point something out. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who is one of the leading halachas of our generation, passed away I don't have the day in front of me, the year in front of me, but I think it was the 1980s. I think he passed away. Maybe it was 1990s. In any event, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein pointed out that if you have two doctors and one of them is observant and religious, and the other one is not, but the one who's not religious is actually more of an expert than the one who's religious, you listen to the one who's more of an expert. Because this has nothing to do with your rabbinic background. We want to know the best medical opinion on the table. And that's how we make our decision. So now let's apply this to our conversation. I think it's going to become fairly straightforward. The verdict is, what do the military experts say? And if you'll notice, the people we quoted recently were more politicians. And we'll take a look at page 140 in a second, which is a really cool New York Times ad. But if you go back to text 9A and 9B, both of which were military experts, right? There seems to be a difference of opinion. And now we need to start gathering what are current, up-to-date military opinions. So we're not going to do that right now, but if you would like to, there's an appendix C, which is on page 154. You can take a look. It's almost a little exhaustive, of many military experts, and most of them seem to be of the opinion that a two-state solution presents a mortal danger for Israel today, right now. In other words, what might happen in the future is a different discussion. But right now, today, it would endanger more lives than it would save. Okay, and if that wasn't every military expert's opinion, we're all young enough to remember 2005, right? When Israel unilaterally pulled out of Gaza, and we know where we are. There's been 4 or 5 wars since then, strictly with Hamas and Gaza, right? There's been much more, but Hamas and Gaza. So that's that we see how that turned out. But just to show you the paradigm shift that we attempted to make today, I want you to take a look at page 140. Okay, this is an exercise you have in front of you. This is an ad that was pulled out in the New York Times. Okay, somebody paid for this ad in the New York Times, on a page of the New York Times, and it's about Israel. It says, in a turbulent world, Israel's security chiefs agree separation into 2 states is essential for Israel's security. Right? There's 14 people here in this ad. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 people. I'm sorry. There are 16 experts, so to speak, here on the table. All right. Look at the exercise. We're going to try to judge them through this lens only. Number one, how many different reasons are expressed in this ad in support of a 2-state solution? So try to kind of group them together, right? You don't have to do this now. It's okay. You can do this in your own time. Some of them have more of political leaning. Some of them have Zionist leaning. And then there's, to the best of my reading here, there's only 2 of them. Some of them are ambiguous as to what exactly. They just say they feel that it's essential for Israel's security. They don't say why. There's only 2 of them. Take a look at Diskin and Yatom. You see those? Yuval Diskin. The unsolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict represents an existential threat. His reasoning here is, regardless of which side of the aisle he stands on, his reasoning is security, safety. We need to reach an agreement now before we reach the point of no return, which presumably, based on his words, would be an existential threat. And then take a look at Yatom. Is everybody finding these, right? Danny Yatom. He says, without a peace initiative, the fighting and violence will continue. That's what he's worried about. And our isolation process will deepen. Okay? And I think this brings us to another important point, which means the military is being an expert on matters of security. And thus, for a military expert's reason to be halachically binding, it must be based exclusively on pikuach nefesh, only on safety and security, right? So let's take a look here just now, and we could add to this Reshef that we read earlier, which was text 9b, right? I'm sorry, text 9a. These people, even though they're expressing a concern about Israel's security, neither of them answers the question about the present. In other words, does this provide more security now, or does it provide more security in the long term? What is more dangerous at this moment, ceding land or keeping land? And then you can contrast this again. If you take a look at the appendix, for all the military officials who say that if you take a look today, the biggest issue at hand is that if we start some sort of a two-state solution, or if you start to give away more land, every piece of land you give away seems to put more lives at risk, Jewish lives and Arab lives. And indeed, that's where Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, whom we cited above, he arrives at that same conclusion. So for a little historical context, at one point he had been pro giving back pieces of land, and he clarifies in this statement, so we're on page 143, he clarifies that it's all about Israel's security. Before we do that, by the way, it's just it's very enlightening. Take a look at the map on page 142, which is if Israel were to give away the West Bank, just to understand how thin the defensive depth of Israel would be, which means if somebody wants to come and cut off Israel at the neck and separate the Golan Heights from the rest of Israel, et cetera, right? Which means separating troops, et cetera, which is certainly would be the first strategy that any enemy of Israel would follow. It's 8.8 miles. Okay, for context, that's a little more than a half of what I ran in the Pasadena Marathon, the Pasadena Half Marathon. Okay, which means I can probably run that today and not even feel sore tomorrow. I can probably run the width of Israel's defensive depth were we to give back the West Bank. And that's something that's very important to keep in mind. You don't hear enough people talking about it. You hear people talking about all sorts of other things, and it's important that we keep the Torah glasses on, which are, is this going to make people, human life, safer? And the answer is clearly not. It's a resounding no. And so let's see what Ovadia Yosef says in text 12. Heidi, I think it's your turn, page 143.
To our honorable brothers residing in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, may peace be with you, and may you be blessed with eternal peace. I wish to clarify my position on the matter of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. As I have explained in the past on more than one occasion, the halachic ruling that I issued in the past regarding the permissibility of returning land for peace, is no longer relevant given the present circumstance. I had intended only and purely that ceding territory is permitted if it leads to authentic peace, one in which Jerusalem and its neighboring areas would dwell in peace and harmony. But we now see with our eyes that, to the contrary, giving away territory from our Holy Land puts lives in danger. It is not for this peace that we hoped and prayed. Therefore, the Oslo Agreement is null and void. I'm at peace with them, but though I speak of peace, they come to wage war. Psalms 120, verse 7. We have no one on whom to rely other than our Father in heaven.
So the point that he's making is that from a Torah perspective, remember this is the former chief rabbi of Israel, from a Torah perspective, the most important thing to judge everything through is it going to bring peace or not? And he's obviously of the opinion that not, and not only he's of the opinion, but he's quoting he's not quoting here, but he has quoted military personnel as being on that side of the fence. Now, the obvious rebuttal to that is, so then what should we do? What should we do to bring about peace, right? And this is really hinted to in his last line, where he quotes from not from Psalms, where he quotes from the Talmud that we have no one on whom to rely other than our Father in heaven. The most common rebuttal that anyone who hears someone passionately said we should not be giving any land away, so he says, okay, no problem, I hear it. You're against the two-state solution. You're against giving back land, and I agree with you and I respect you, etc. But we have to do something. Like what should we do? I believe that question is rooted in a Zionist dream, which I'm not saying that I don't have Zionist leanings. I do have some of them, but here is where things start to get very Zionistic and not very Jewish. If those two can be separated, Zionist versus Jewish, It starts to get very Zionist, not Jewish. What do I mean? Theodor Herzl, had a very messianic vision of what he intended for Israel to be. So, Jews living a utopian and peaceful life in their ancestral homeland, etc. In order for that to happen, he was willing to do whatever it is in order for that to happen. The problem with that, and Herzl was not very religious, the problem with that is that from a religious perspective, from a Torah perspective, we do have to appreciate that we still live in exile. And Mashiach has not yet come, which means it's not our responsibility to find the answer to find a peace in the Middle East. Our responsibility that the Torah gives us today is to make sure that everyone is safe. Make sure we're not endangering lives and that we're preserving as many lives as possible. Beyond that, in other words, to start thinking, so what's going to be? You have to do something because how this is going to continue forever? Leave that to Hashem. It's not our business. In other words, if it's endangering human lives, then it is, because that's our obligation. But if it's about how do we preserve a Jewish state and the Palestinian state, all that sort of thing, if it's within the context of obligations that we have, which is preserving life and not endangering lives, then of course that's our responsibility. That's a responsibility given to us by God. But there's nowhere in the Torah where Hashem enjoins us, where Hashem commands us that we have to figure out how we're going to get back to Israel with Mashiach. Hashem says, leave that part to me. It's very clear. And by then, I want to make this absolutely clear. Until Mashiach comes, there won't be a perfect solution. Because one person will come up with one solution, another person will come up with another solution, and there will never be a perfect solution. Because Mashiach is the perfect solution. And just to really drive this home, okay, because this might sound a little extreme, just really drive this home, the reason I'm separating that is because very often, if you're just thinking about the Zionist dream, you know who right away falls aside? And the whole world is upset at us about that? The Arab population. Our obligation today is both to the Jewish population and the Arab population to make sure we're saving lives, preserving life, and not endangering life. And more importantly, to make sure that to ease their plight and provide for their needs in Israel. Because those are Jewish values. Those are Torah values. Establishing a state that will be larger or smaller or whatever that's not necessarily a Torah value. In other words, we'll wait for Mashiach to come to actually have the full land of Israel. And that's weird. If you recall, I mentioned that some of what the Torah is saying might surprise you, because we would even give back the Western Wall if we knew 100%. Now, I don't believe that that's going to bring any peace whatsoever. And there's a huge thing on the table here, which is that the Arabs do not want peace with us. So we have to figure out, despite there being somebody here who doesn't want peace, how do we preserve more lives? That's where a wall comes in. That's where an Iron Dome comes in. These are amazing initiatives that Israel did, which both protect Jewish lives and Arab lives. And in Israel, we do our best. And I'm not saying that everyone in government agrees with this. And there are those that don't. And I think that's very dangerous. We have to do our best to ease the plight of Palestinians or Arabs that are within Israel's borders as well, because that is the most important thing when it comes to the Torah. I hope that another thing that you walk away with today is a mutual respect. I try to do a lot of justice to both sides of this argument. And I know that we didn't necessarily answer it, right? Because I'll point out that if something were to change, right now, it does not seem at all likely that if we give back any land, that's going to bring more stability or more security to the region. But if somehow that were to change, it's important to understand that the Torah's perspective would change. In other words, the Torah would then be pro giving back land. Somehow, I don't know, maybe like let's just in order to provide for this thought experiment, let's say another 60 years, chas v'shalom, heaven forbid, go by and Mashiach doesn't come. And 60 years from now, all the current leaders die, and somehow there's like a few cultural movements, and it turns out that the Arabs really, if they just have this city, then it's really going to be peace. And everybody agrees that that's actually what's going to happen. And it would be more secure for the Jewish people, etc. I don't know, Hamas falls and there's new movements, etc. A new movement, and Arabs, education is changing. Everything changes from the ground up, and it's much more peaceful. Then it would be our obligation to give a particular piece of land, even if it was the Western Wall. Again, for the thought experiment, to make it practical, maybe we would have to give the Temple Mount so that they can have it done with the rock. We would do that as Jews. Why? Because if that actually did bring about preservation of life and peace and security for people and preserving human life, then that's what we would do. So hopefully this gives us a lot more of a powerful respect towards both sides of the argument. And ideally, like I said, I don't know if you're about to adopt all of the Torah's perspectives. Everybody has their own political leanings and their own views about Israel, etc. We're all Jewish. We've all been talking about Israel since we're born. But hopefully having this Torah perspective gives you a lot more of a robust paradigm through which to view it, which in my opinion is the old. I think it's the only paradigm through which we as Jews should be looking through the Torah's perspective. And I'll conclude, I'm going to take 4 minutes to go over time. I'll conclude with one more point, like a practical takeaway. Like I always say, because none of us are about to decide this issue, we're anyways all just sitting in Pasadena. I want to conclude with one final thought, which is this whole conversation today is based on a verse from Leviticus, from Vayikra. Joanne, can you read it for us, please? Text 13a.
Observe my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them.
And the Talmud has a very, very fascinating observation here. Go ahead.
Live by them, do not die because of them.
This is the origin for the fact that we go and desecrate Shabbat in order to save someone's life, for the fact that we eat on Yom Kippur in order to make sure someone survives it, etc. And there's actually a much deeper element here. It's not just don't die by them, live by them. In other words, mitzvahs are not meant for us to die, but they're meant for us to live by. The Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Chabad Rebbe, related a story about his grandmother. Okay, his grandmother was a woman by the name of Rebbetzin Rivka, and and she was very, very ill during a certain part of her life. And Joanne, if you can please read for us what her father told her. Go ahead.
When my grandmother,
Father-in-law.
Rebbetzin Rivka,
I said her father-in-law. I just want to correct myself. Go ahead.
when my grandmother, Rebbetzin Rivka of blessed memory, was 18 years old in 1851, she fell ill, and the physician ordered her to eat immediately upon awakening. As she did not wish to eat before morning prayers, she began praying earlier in the morning, and then following this, she would eat. When her father-in-law, the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe, learned of this, he said to her, "A Jew must be healthy and strong. The Torah says regarding mitzvot, live by them." This verse can also be interpreted to mean that we must infuse our mitzvot with life and vitality. To do so, one must be strong and joyful. He concluded, "You should not go without food. Better to eat in order to pray than pray in order to eat." He then gave her a blessing for longevity. She was born in 1833 and passed away in 1914.
Life in this world is a journey. It's a journey that we are meant to live. And the Torah, which is kind of like our user manual, I always call it, right? To life, like when you get a car and you get a user manual, right? So our user manual for life and it's there to show us what it means to live. Practically, but also spiritually. It's not enough to go through the motions of doing mitzvot and serving God. We have to infuse the way we live our lives with life, because that's the whole purpose of the Torah. So to summarize, where were we here? I felt a little bit behind in the slides. So these are the people from the New York Times ad. And we asked what is their reasoning. We went through it. Okay. Some are ambiguous. Some of them. I should have been showing these slides while I was talking. Okay, it is what it is. Some are possibly security related, but they don't really address whether it's an immediate security issue or a eventual security issue. We spoke about Israel's defensive depth, which by the way is 2/3 the length of Manhattan, and how important it is that there should be military people and security experts, the ones that are giving us the reasonings about deciding these things. So the Torah establishes deciding principles, and currently those principles dictate that ceding land constitutes present danger. But if it changes, then of course we would give back land. Till the arrival of Mashiach, there'll be no perfect peace. And until that time, these are our responsibilities. Okay. The lesson that we want to end off with is that we should serve God with vitality, with life.
Lesson
Here,
4.
We'll get our
Occupied
lesson,
with peace. 1. The two-state solution is a widely endorsed diplomatic solution for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, with broad international support. 2. Various Torah laws and values have bearing on the permissibility of territorial concessions. From the halachic perspective, however, the overriding factor is the potential for pekuach nefesh, or danger to human life. If territorial concessions put lives at risk, it is forbidden. If territorial concessions save lives, then it is compulsory. 3. Non-pekuach nefesh arguments, such as the ideological and demographic considerations, political or economic fallout, international standing, etc., cannot override pekuach nefesh considerations. 4. Present and immediate pekuach nefesh overrides potential pekuach nefesh in the future. 5. We turn to Israel's security experts with all questions relating to national security. 6. Israel must do its utmost to protect all lives, as well as seek to ease the plight of Arabs under its control. 7. Land for peace is a polarizing issue, one that causes rifts in the Jewish community. We must strive to genuinely listen to one another and appreciate the valid points that each side brings to the table, and thereby increase Jewish unity and mutual respect. Next week, in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, once much of the euphoria wore off, extreme diversity in perspective and reaction emerged toward the war and toward the State of Israel. These fundamental differences in perspective, ranging from the very secular to the extremely religious and nationalist, exist until this very day. Next week, we will explore the factors underlying this fragmentation and how they influence Israel's political process today.
Thank you all for joining us for lesson 4. This has been lesson 4 of Survival of a Nation, which is titled Occupied with Peace. I hope I didn't offend anybody along the way. Hopefully you gained a lot of perspectives. And please join us next week, either at 1:00 p.m. next Monday, or on Zoom, or at 7:30 p.m. in person for lesson 5, Israel in Perspective, Viewpoints on the Land's Identity.
Actually, it was very, very